Hey everyone, welcome back to Try4 Nutrition. My name is MJ, and today's video I'm going to talk all about my nutrition strategy for a 70.3 triathlon race, so a middle distance triathlon or a half Ironman. And I'm going to go through the exact nutritional strategies that I would use and that I advise my athletes to use. I'm going to talk through them step by step just to give you a bit of a blueprint for you to use potentially moving forward. But if anything, it's going to give you some really good ideas and maybe the outline of a structure or a strategy that you can use, and then you can test it and tailor it to your liking. So let's just get stuck straight into the video. Okay, so let's start off with some key reminders, just some things that you can think about ahead of the race, including your pre-race meal as well. So the first thing I've got here is consider reducing fiber in the 2 to 3 days ahead of your race. And what I mean by that is go down to about 10 to 15 grams per day. It's not gonna do any real long-term harm having a little less fiber for a couple of days. Most people don't take on board enough fiber anyway, but you just want to reduce the risk of any digestive upset by having lots of fiber, which happens to some people. So in the 2 to 3 days, maybe even the 4 days ahead of time, reduce that fiber. The second thing I wanted to remind you of was carb loading does not need to follow a low carb few days. So science used to say when you carb load, you have to have low carb couple of days and then whack your carbs right up, and that's going to allow you to get more carbohydrates, glucose into the muscles and into storage. That is no longer thought to be the case, so you don't need to do that. It's much more simple. You can just, in the 3 to 4 days ahead of your race, you can just whack your carbs up to 8 to 10 grams per kilogram of body weight, and that will give you that carb loading effect. So it's definitely worth trying. Then when we get to the pre-race meal, aim to have it 2 to 4 hours ahead of time. I would say limit your fiber and your fat again, because you want to speed up the rate of carbohydrate digestion and absorption into the muscle tissues. So really just focus on the carbs in that pre-race meal. Chuck in a little bit of protein as well, because that can help with reducing muscle soreness throughout the race. So maybe 10 to 15 grams of protein as well, but essentially just focus on the carbs in that pre-race meal. And you want to have around 1.5 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight. So as an example, if you weigh 70 kilograms, 1.5 times 70, 105. So you want around 105 grams of carbs. That isn't exact science, so this is where the kind of test and trial what works for you comes in. If you have 120, 130, 150, it's probably not going to make that much of a difference. But what you want to think about is how much food you can take on board and how much you can digest and absorb. So you don't want to go too crazy, but yeah, around about 1.5 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight should be fine for most people. Some athletes like to add electrolytes to their water the morning of the race. There isn't loads of science out there that says this makes a massive difference, but if anything, it gets you into that habit of starting to take on board electrolytes during your race day, because you're going to be taking on board a lot of electrolytes, or you're going to need to. Next up, we've got some 70.3 plus specific considerations. When I say 70.3 plus, I mean you could use this for an Ironman, a full distance as well, and you could use parts of it, certainly the running parts, for a half marathon or a marathon. But I just want to go through some considerations that I think are worthwhile thinking about. So first of all, have a plan that you've tested, like the one I'm going to talk you through. Don't wing it. You know, you're doing a lot of exercise in a 70.3 race. You're going to be racing for several hours, so you can't wing it unless you really want to put yourself at risk of bonking, hitting the wall, and not really having a strategy that works for you. Next thing is to say is fatigue will set in at some stage because you're putting your body through a lot, right? Don't wait for that to set in before you start taking on board nutrition. I see this all the time, especially when people are in training for these kinds of races, is you wait until you feel a bit tired and then you eat something. The reality is if you wait until you're tired, it's too late, because you've got to give your body time to respond in terms of digesting the food and getting access to the energy within it. So the bike is where it's vital to consume the right amount. So what do I mean by that? Well, the bike is where you spend most of the time in any triathlon race. And that's where you're relatively stable, depending on the course, but you can get yourself tucked in and you can be in a relatively stable state. So that's really where you can do some damage, some good damage when it comes to your nutrition. So really think about your bike strategy, and I'll come on to what that looks like. Using aid stations could be key, but don't rely on them. I talk to athletes all the time about this. Don't bank on good aid stations being in the race. Yeah, it might work, and if you're going to a big Ironman race or a challenge race or something like that, then chances are you're going to get a good aid station, but just don't rely on them. Don't get into the habit of relying on them, because the time where they're not that good and you do rely on them and you get caught short, you could be onto a hide-in for nothing. Check your nutrition stations ahead of time. So what I mean by this is check how you're going to store your nutrition on the bike, check how you're going to store nutrition when you're running. You obviously can't take on board anything when you're swimming, but just check the kit that you've got for storing nutrition. Certainly when it comes to transitions as well, you want to make sure that you've got quick access to the nutrition. So again, on race morning, go through your plan, go through your kit, make sure that you've got the right storage and everything set up. And the final point is timing is everything. So getting your timing right could be the difference between having a really good nutrition strategy and having an okay strategy or a really poor one. And I'm going to come on to that a little bit later. Cool. So next thing then is any race specific considerations. So are there any things that you want to think about when you're testing this strategy or maybe tailoring it a little bit? So first of all is the temperature. So is it really, really hot or is it really, really cold? If it's really, really hot, you're going to sweat loads. So you want to then start to think about things like humidity, your sweat rate, because those things are going to make a massive difference in terms of how much fluid you lose, how much sodium and other electrolytes you lose out of your sweat. So you really want to think about the conditions, and depending on the conditions, you can then tailor the strategy that I'm going to give you up or down and kind of test what works for you in the conditions that you've got. Then think about the course itself. So the example I would use here is if you're on a course where it's really hilly and you're going up and down, you probably want to look at the course ahead of time and think about the spots on the course where it's going to be easier for you to consume some nutrition. So for example, you're not going to be taking on board a massive gel or a chew bar or a flapjack or something if you're bombing down a hill at 50, 60 kilometers per hour. That's quite dangerous. So think about the course. If it's really, really flat, you're probably okay. But if there's hills in the course or it's rolling, just think about that and consider if there's any impact on the strategy that you use. And then, as I said before, the aid station setup. It may be the case that you've tested products that don't work for you. In this situation, if you have an aid station that has those products on them, you don't want to rely on those products because you know that they don't work for you. So having a look at that can also really help with your overall approach to the day. Okay, so we're actually onto the race. So let's first talk about the swim and T1. So of course, when you're on the swim, there's no opportunity to consume anything, and that makes your pre-race meal vital. It's one of the reasons why it's vital. Having a pre-race meal just makes you feel like you're ready to go, right? And you can then get off on the swim. And if you're out there for 30, 40 minutes, you know you can go pretty hard and you've got something in the tank to fuel that. But what that means is T1 is the first opportunity that you get to get your first bit of nutrition in. So I always say, take on board 30 grams at transition, just get into transition one, bang in 30 grams. So you might have a banana, an energy bar, an energy gel, maybe two. Get that first bit of nutrition in, and that starts to get you into the habit of taking on nutrition as you're going through the race. If you really want to be fast in T1, which I know a lot of people do, get on the bike and get something in as soon as you're on the bike and you're out of transition. And just remember to double check your nutrition before you exit T1, because the last thing you want to do is have some of your nutrition dropped on the floor and you haven't noticed it because you're in a rush to get out. So just take 5-10 seconds to double check your nutrition. And if you've checked it beforehand, before the race has started, you'll probably be fine. But just take that second to double check your nutrition to make sure you haven't left anything, because the last thing you want is to get out on the course and realize you're down by 60, 90, 100 grams of carbs because you've left them in transition. Okay, so now we're out onto the bike. We've done the swim, onto the bike. And as I said before, there is an opportunity to take on a lot of food and energy on the bike. So this is where the tactics start to come in, and this is really where the strategy starts from a nutrition perspective. So 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour, but I would always recommend going higher if you possibly can, because you're getting more energy in, so why wouldn't you? So aim for 90 if you can. I know some of the pros go up to like 120, 130, but just stick to that 90 grams and you should be fine. And the way that I like to do it from a tactics perspective is there's two ways: 30 grams every 20 minutes or 45 grams every 30 minutes, which keeps it nice and simple. You haven't got to think too much about it. So I always say every 20 minutes, just take on board a gel, for example, or a flapjack or a banana. Maybe you won't carry that many bananas. You're probably on just gels and maybe some energy bars. But one gel, 25 to 30 grams, just makes it really easy. You can think every 20 minutes, we're going to take on board 30 grams, and per hour you've got about the right amount in. From a hydration perspective, 600 mils to a litre per hour. Consider electrolytes and maybe energy powders within the fluid if you want to do that as well, because that's also a way of getting some additional energy in. I always recommend from an electrolyte perspective, Precision Hydration do a pH 1500. It's quite a high sodium, high concentrate. So there are some lower sodium ones if you don't think that you sweat that much. Put that in 1 or 2 bottles, so 1 tablet per bottle, and you should be fine from an electrolyte perspective. But here is the rub with this. If it's really, really hot and you're sweating a lot, so if you're racing in the heat, this is where you probably want to make sure that you've got an electrolyte tablet in every single bottle of water that you consume, just to make sure that you're getting on board some sodium and some electrolytes to replenish a lot of those which you're going to be losing. And I think with this, it's really important to test the products and the timings within your training plan. So in other videos, I bang on about this quite a lot, but test the products, test the timings, figure out what works for you, because the last thing you want is to carry a load of nutrition that you don't get on with and not get into the habit of consuming the right amount of energy in the right time frames, which can really just mess up your day, because you really want to focus on the race itself. You just want to focus on going hard on the bike, being in the right position, making sure you're not drafting, being safe, all these things. The last thing you want to then be worried about is what you're doing with nutrition and trying to work out in your head or risking having some digestive issues. So focus on the basics, make it simple, and test it, and you should be fine. Okay, so we're now into T1 and the run, which is obviously the final part of your triathlon. So the first thing is, when you get into T2, check your nutrition before you rush out of T2. Again, just like in T1, you don't want to run out of T2 onto your run and realize you've left half your nutrition on the floor. The same volume as the bike, so 60 to 90 grams per hour. But the only difference here, and this is the key difference between the run and the bike, is you want to consider front loading to maximize your energy absorption before the end of the run, which is the end of the race. You don't want to take on board loads of nutrition towards the end and not give your body enough time to access it, right? So what I like to suggest is stick to gels, because first of all, it's easier on the stomach. And if you think about when you're running, you're going to be bouncing up and down quite a lot and moving around more, and it's going to just disturb the stomach more than it would on the bike. So stick to gels because they're just easier on the tummy. And again, that's why it's really important to test the products that work well for you. But in this instance, consume little and often. So rather than every 20 minutes like you do on the bike, on the run, you can just have a pouch and you can just be sipping it every couple of minutes, taking on board a little bit at a time. So for example, Precision Hydration, they do a 90 gram carb pouch, and it's really good for that. I usually just take 2 of those, stick one down my tri-suit, have one in my hand, have the lid off, and I just take on board a couple of sips of the 90 gram carb pouch every couple of minutes, and I find that I rifle through it quite quickly. So that's really, really an easy way of getting a lot of carbs in without too much fuss. Carry extra just in case. So this is back to the kind of make sure you've got enough and a little bit extra on top of that as well. And finally, don't rely on the aid stations, but use them to your advantage if you can. If you've got loads of things in the aid station that work for you, great, but don't rely on them. Just make sure you've got enough to get you through, just in case the aid stations aren't going to work for you. And that's the end of the race. So first thing to say is take the time to celebrate. You don't do these races that often. They're big achievements, so of course you want to celebrate them. And the first thing I'll say here is I totally understand that you want to go out and celebrate, and that's fine. I'm just going to give you some of the guidance that I would generally think about using in that post-race 24 to 48 hours, just to give you a better chance at recovery and minimize the risk of injury and things like that. So a couple of things to focus on. Protein and carbohydrates, so a ratio of 1 to 4. So for every 1 gram of protein, have 4 grams of carbohydrates, and that's going to aid glucose reuptake into the muscles and into the liver, but it's also going to aid with muscle repair. So 1 to 2 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight, and then have a quarter of that in protein, and that should see you good. And what I always say here is you want to aim for whole form foods, because whole form foods are packed full of vitamins and minerals, so they're very nutritionally dense. And that's vital for supporting recovery across the whole process. So not just about carbs and protein, but it's also about all the individual processes inside the human body that also need vitamins and minerals to help you recover. And you also want to avoid additional inflammation through inflammatory foods if you can avoid it. So things like deep fried food, trans fatty food, which basically means really ultra processed junk food. And I know it's really, really delicious, but those foods can promote a state of inflammation. And when you get to the end of a race and a couple of days afterwards, you're going to be in a high state of inflammation already because you've put your body through the ringer. So you want to avoid adding to that inflammation. So avoid deep fried foods, trans fatty foods, ultra processed foods if you can, or just try to minimize them and surround them with lots of nice whole foods as well. And the final thing that I'd say is continue to hydrate post the race, and maybe consider putting some electrolyte tablets in for the next 12 or 24 hours, especially if you've raced in really hot and humid conditions and if you've sweat a lot through the race. You're always going to sweat a fair bit anyway, regardless of the conditions, but especially in hot races, you want to make sure you're topping back up those lost electrolytes through food as well, but consider putting a couple of tablets in your water for the 12 to 24 hours at the end. So there you go, that is my nutrition strategy for a 70.3 triathlon race. Now there are loads of aspects to that strategy which you may want to tailor and test and make your own, but what I wanted to do is make a video to show you the basic outline of a nutrition strategy for a race like a 70.3. I hope that's been really useful for you and that you've got something out of it. Happy to take any questions in the comments section below, so add your questions and I'll be happy to answer them when I can. I've put the link to my website below as well, so you can check out all the services that we do. And please like and subscribe to the channel, because if you like and subscribe, then hopefully I can make more content and reach more curious athletes just like you. And with that being said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.